Well, I think we're all here this morning because we look forward to continuing the journey with Doug. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Christie?
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thank you. I love this sense of the power that certain people at BW have to forgive parking tickets. I mean, it feels kind of like a very special power that one of the perks of the job that you don't know you're going to have when you're hired, that you can forgive parking tickets. Well, thank you for being here this morning, and thank you for those of you who were here last night coming for a second round. I want to say something just very briefly at the beginning. There is, in the monastic traditions, a practice or a sensibility known as ruminatio, or rumination, and it's something that those who set out into the desert came to value very deeply, and it simply refers to the need, and usually for them it was in relation to a word of some kind that they received from an elder, or sometimes a text from scripture that they were given to meditate on. And the understanding was that it could sometimes take a very, very long time to digest this word into your life. So the practice of ruminatio was understood to be a kind of a discipline of attentive wonder at what God might be saying to you in your life, and that this the meaning of it may take days, weeks, years, your whole lifetime to digest and absorb, but it's worth it. The important things are worth ruminating over and coming to a deeper understanding of. I mention that because I'm going to, for those of you who felt like maybe at the end of last night that was quite enough darkness, thank you very much. I'm not going to do that again exactly, but I am going to turn the lens slightly this morning to look a little more deeply at the desert and the power of the desert as an image that can help us, I think. But there are similarities, and in a way, what those of you who were here last night are invited into is a process of ruminatio on these same kind of themes, but maybe framed a little bit differently. And for those of you who were not here last night, you can just take this as as a fresh invitation to enter the desert. The faces of those women, las mujeres embarazadas, the women who were pregnant when they were kidnapped and brought to La Perla by the military forces during the period of La Dictadura in the late 1970s, who were then tortured and murdered and disappeared. The only traces of whose lives that remain are in these photographs that hang suspended from the ceiling. I stand alone in the gloom of this late afternoon, gazing up at these beautiful faces. Rain cascades down the walls just outside. Inside, it is quiet, still, but my mind is racing. I try to imagine the lives these women lived before their abductions, the dreams they had for themselves, for their soon-to-be children, for their world. I strain, without quite realizing I'm doing this, to conjure their presence, if only to push back a little against the brute fact of their disappearance. But I cannot do it, at least not in this moment. I cannot bridge the gap. It is too immense. I find myself reduced to silence. This is not the first time I've encountered this feeling. Since first arriving in Argentina a little over 3 years ago, I made it a practice to come to La Perla each semester with my students, to spend part of a day moving through this space together, to enter in as we were able, to pay attention, and yes, to stand with those souls who passed through this place once, never to be seen or heard from again. It has been a humbling, disturbing experience. And no, it has not become any easier over time to enter into the suffering, loss, and emptiness that marks this place. If anything, it feels more difficult each time I come here. For even as I struggle to open myself to the place and to the lives of those who lived and suffered here, I'm aware of the severe limits of my capacity to do so. I descend into silence because I must, because any effort to say what this place is or what it means ultimately runs up against the brute fact of the incommensurable. We cannot know, or what we can know is so small in comparison to the vastness of what must remain unknown that we move instinctively toward silence. There are no words, not really. Only the marks of pain which trace countless fine lines through history. Only the immensity of grief and loss within which we move together for a time on a dark, rain-drenched day here on the outskirts of Cordoba, Argentina. This immensity feels unbounded, endless, and standing within it is strangely disorienting, bewildering even. There is no firm ground on which to stand. There are no clear landmarks to guide your movement. You feel yourself moving out onto the very edge of things, the very edge of yourself. Here you enter into an unexpected borderland, a liminal space that requires you to abandon the categories and language you have always employed to tell yourself where you are, who you are, a kind of desert. There are so many of these desert places in our world and in our lives, places where our capacity to comprehend our own experience meets with an inevitable silence in the face of all that is and must remain unknown. It is difficult not to feel a sense of estrangement in such places. There is no narrative or pattern to help you make sense of things, at least not one which offers much comfort. There is only the unending horizon. It can be a balm to look out onto such a horizon, relief from the confining precincts that so often shape our lives. But it can also be, and often is, simply bewildering or worse. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me, Blaise Pascal once exclaimed. Here the expanse is eternity itself. But we know this terror also in the many deserts, personal, political, ecological, through which we travel in our own lives. Often, and for good reason, we turn away from these immense empty spaces. The silence, the endless horizon, and yes, the immensity of suffering we find ourselves called to confront. It is simply too much to bear. And so we turn away. We refuse the invitation to walk down that path, to open ourselves to that immensity. Still, to speak in this way is a little misleading, for in a very real sense, we are already in the desert. It is and always has been a defining feature of our lives, the space within which we live and move and have our being. The immensity is, as Meister Eckhart and other Christian mystics have testified, the ground of our existence. So there is a paradox. The desert is the very climate of our lives, the deepest truth of our existence, the place in which we come to know God, ourselves, and one another most fully. It is a kind of paradise, and it is a place of profound struggle, in which our very longing to know ourselves, God, and one another must undergo a purification so radical, a relinquishment so far-reaching that we become lost to ourselves, lost in the immensity. This vision of the spiritual life as a dangerous, uncompromising, lifelong journey into the wild desert of God has long been cherished by Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart, Hadovich of Brabant, and John of Ruysbroek, all give vivid expression to this vision in their work, pushing language to its extremes in order to inquire into those dimensions of our experience of self and God so potent and necessary that can give expression to it only by conjuring the presence of an immensity, a void, a desert, or a dark stillness. In one of his early works, The Realm of Lovers, Ruysbroeck describes the journey this way. With respect to being lost in the darkness of the desert, nothing is left over, for there is no giving or taking there, but a simple, one-fold essence. In it, God and all those united to God are sunken away and lost, and they can never find themselves again in this modeless essence. You have to hold on tight when you read some of these mystics. Where are they exactly taking us? For it is a pure, simple one-foldedness, and this is the highest blessedness in the realm of God. Nevertheless, all these spirits have to turn downward into works of charity and into all virtues. For the greater and nobler a person is, the more he or she is common to all those who have need of him, corporally and spiritually. It's an incredible vision, really, of the spiritual life, the sense that we are at once called to descend into our very, very depths, where we become one with God, and then called forth out of those depths to be one with all, to enter into the common life. And Ruysbroeck and others want to hold this intention, our deep oneness with God, that is also our deep communion with others. It's difficult to avoid feeling a little queasy in the face of such an account of our life in God, even though Ruysbroeck presents it to us in the most matter-of-fact terms. Nothing is left over. This is what it is to be lost in the darkness of the desert, a self-emptying so utter that nothing is left over, a stark, even forbidding vision of relinquishment and self-abnegation. And there is also the sense of radical disorientation. All those united to God are sunken away and lost, and they can never find themselves again in this modeless essence. Elsewhere, Ruysbroeck describes those called to this life in these terms: thus they want to dwell there and never come back, deep in that lostness. The movement from lost to found is well known in the Christian spiritual tradition. It is one of the most enduring of our expressions of salvation. I was lost, and now am found. But ever greater lostness, being so lost that you can never hope to find yourself again, this is something else again, something altogether different. Even if you are lost in God, it remains a strange and bewildering vision of the spiritual life, one that cuts against the grain of a strong and deep-seated hope that most of us, I suspect, carry within us, that we will somehow be found, somehow find our way home. Who among us really wishes to remain lost forever? I think, in fact, there is a paradoxical discovery of home and belonging that one can discern in this language of radical lostness found among the Christian mystics. To enter this desert and risk becoming lost in its immensity is potentially to find oneself drawn into the most intimate and profound encounter with God, our own self, and the lives of others. But such knowledge does not yield itself easily, and this, I think, is precisely where much of its value lay for us. For in responding to the invitation to become well and truly lost, we open ourselves to the possibility that we may discover how to love without precondition or fear, how to stand with those in our midst who feel most lost or abandoned. This is the meaning of Royce Brooks' consistent refusal to separate the call from becoming lost in the darkness of the desert of God from the call to embrace and stand within what he refers to simply as the common life, that is, the deep bond that connects us with all other living beings. In what follows, I want to consider this idea a little more fully, asking how our mystical traditions, especially those that invite us into the vastness of the desert, can help us grapple with gaps, silences, and empty spaces that have become such a prominent feature of contemporary experience. And I want to ask how the attention to the wild otherness of God found in these traditions, a negative knowledge accessible only through radical abandonment, might inform our own efforts to stand with one another in those places of emptiness. I began these reflections with my own sense of bewilderment at encountering the traces of those lives lost forever at La Perla. The sense of bewilderment is with me still. The presence and absence of those lost souls has entered deeply into my consciousness and has now become part of the fabric of my soul. What this means and how it has impacted my life and my orientation to spiritual practice, I cannot easily say, but I know it has. Perhaps it is something as simple as beginning to come to open myself more fully to the practice of what Salvadoran Jesuit John Sobrino calls fidelity to the real. For Sobrino, such fidelity means opening ourselves as deeply and honestly as we can to the full complexity and ambiguity of the world in which we live, especially the reality of those whose very hold on existence is most precarious and uncertain. It also implies, I believe, a commitment to remain open and attentive to the reality of simple beauty in our lives. For Christians, the truth of the Incarnation demands this of us. Still, there is a special call in this moment to attend to the deep lostness that is such a significant part of our experience of the world. There is an echo of this sensibility toward the beginning of Papa Francisco's recent encyclical, Laudato Si. Our goal, he says, referring to the deeper work that must be undertaken if we are to have any hope of addressing our acute environmental crisis, is to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. To become painfully aware, what will it mean for us to take this idea seriously? There is without question a serious and challenging personal dimension to this call. This painful awareness must become our own, not merely something of which we have heard secondhand. So, we must be willing to risk becoming vulnerable to the suffering and struggle of others, not standing aloof, but entering in as fully as we can. But it also means taking seriously the historically specific and particular expressions of collective suffering, which are so much part of our experience. And it means searching out what response we are called upon to make, whether personally or communally, in our way of living, in our spiritual practice, and in our politics. But it is this particular focus on deepening our capacity for awareness to which I want to give my attention here. It is not an accident that Pope Francis has chosen to emphasize this point so strongly at the outset of his encyclical, for it is nothing less than a wholehearted and radical conversion of our whole being that is being called for, including our awareness of who we are in the world and what it might mean for us to deepen our capacity to stand with one another in solidarity and love. This is one of the reasons why the spiritual traditions of the desert can be so much help to us. They invite us to consider what such radical conversion might actually look like, what it feels like to live out of a transformed awareness, and how this awareness, can contribute to the rekindling of the life of community. The Christian mystical tradition has particular importance here, as it provides us with the clearest access to what the transformed consciousness of those who enter the desert look like. But it is worth pausing to recall that these late medieval traditions trace their roots back to the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, when men and women first began to enter the desert to live a life of silence, solitude, and prayer. Historians such as Peter Brown have helped us recover a sense of how deeply intertwined the spiritual and the social dimensions of this movement were. The person engaging in the act of anachoresis, or withdrawal, into the silence of the desert was, in a very important sense, engaging what Michel de Certeau would call an act of tactical resistance, seeking and often finding a way of standing apart from the crushing weight of the Roman Empire in order to bring healing and reconciliation to a suffering world. The struggle with demons, which was often depicted in highly personal terms in this literature, can also be understood as a way of engaging, responding to, and helping resolve the torments and the difficulties of the age. When Anthony of Egypt emerges from his long struggle in solitude, he engages the larger community as a healer, a consoler, and a person capable of reconciling those who have fallen out of relationship with one another. All of this because of his capacity and willingness to enter freely into the crucible of the desert. This archetypal journey into the desert proved a durable image of spiritual transformation within the Christian tradition. It also became flexible and portable, a flexible and portable metaphor, able to be transposed into a variety of geographical, cultural, and religious contexts. This is what happened in the work of John Scotus Eruginus in the 9th century, for example, who offers what is perhaps the earliest use of the expression, the desert of the divine nature. In the 12th century, the Cistercian myth of the desert led to considerable use of the desert motif, both to signify the inner solitude of the heart, stripped and ready to receive God, and also, at least in the work of Isaac of Stella, to point to the hidden God. And in the 13th century, Thomas Gallus, the Victorine commentator on Dionysius and the Song of Songs, identified the desert of the Song of Songs 3:6 and Exodus 5:3 with what he calls the inaccessible and singular supersubstantial solitude of the eternal Trinity. We could just chant that phrase 3 or 4 times together and it would eventually sink in. We are a long way here from the Egyptian desert. Still, one can sense a certain kinship between the language employed by those who entered deeply into the solitude and silence of that vast desert landscape and the writing of these later figures for whom the desert became such an indispensable image, sometimes for the infinite wildness of God, sometimes for the deepest center of the human soul, and sometimes for the radical relinquishment we must undertake if we are to seek and know the true God. It is this latter idea I want to call attention to here because it is here I believe that we can gain a valuable insight into the character of the radical undoing of the self in emptiness that we witness so often in our own contemporary experience. I do not mean to suggest that these late medieval Christian mystics are speaking of precisely the same kind of emptiness we encounter in our experience. Rather, that their struggle to articulate what it means to be called into the vast, trackless desert of God can help us understand elements of our experience that often remain for us opaque or meaningless. And even if we are not able to understand such experience, it can help us stand within it with greater courage and acceptance. Consider, for example, what it meant to enter the desert in Meister Eckhart's thought. He teaches that our capacity for God, the ground or apex of the soul, is fundamental to who we are. It is our true identity. There is nothing we can do to achieve or manufacture this. It is a gift. And yet we do not always live out of this truth. Our consciousness, far from reflecting this simple and free awareness of God alive in the ground of our being, is instead divided and scattered. We are hostage to 1,000 distractions and fears and anxieties. We are anything but free. In our anxiety, we cling to images and ideas of God rather than the reality of God. But we can learn to become free. We can open ourselves to what Eckhart calls the birth of the word in the ground of the soul. We must. Here, Eckhart's vision leads to a consideration of the meaning of practice, in particular the practice of detachment, the willing relinquishment of everything that is less than God. For Eckhart, this means above all discovering the courage to enter into the bare and empty place within us where the word comes to life in the soul. It means entering the desert. Eckhart employs a range of images: nakedness, emptiness, darkness, unknowing, barrenness, wildness, to get at this central idea, namely that we must be free to receive God, that there must be a space within us if we are to respond to and live in God, if the birth of the word in the soul is to occur. At this birth, he says, God needs and must have a vacant, free, and unencumbered soul, containing nothing but himself alone, and which looks to nothing and nobody but him. Eckhart is commenting here on one of the great New Testament texts of renunciation, where Jesus warns his followers, "Whoever loves anything but me, whoever loves father and mother or many other things is not worthy of me." Like the early Christian monks whose single-minded response to these hard sayings earned them the name apotacticoi, or renunciants, Eckhart gives sustained and pointed attention to these texts of renunciation. He recognizes, as the desert monastics did, that a willingness to let go of everything that is less than God must exist at the very foundation of the soul. It is the posture of openness that makes everything else possible. It is precisely this openness that can and often does create the climate in which the sudden upwelling of God in the soul becomes possible. God must enter into your being and power, says Eckhart, because you have bereft yourself of all possessions and become a desert, as it is written, the voice of the one crying in the wilderness. Let this eternal voice cry out in you as it listeth, and be a desert in respect of yourself in all things. To become a desert, what a strange and beautiful image. For Eckhart, this is a way of speaking of that immense space which opens up within us when we let go of things, become bereft of all possessions. Not simply material possessions, but anything and everything that we substitute for God, including our images of God. God needs no image and has no image, says Eckhart. Without any means, likeness, or image, God operates in the soul, right in the ground where no image ever got in, but only he himself with his own being. This is what it means to enter the desert. It means risking losing everything for the sake of God. The desert is that empty, that stark, that inviting. Anyone who's ever moved through such an empty space knows the strange exhilaration from recognizing that here, perhaps for the first time ever, you can see clearly, breathe deeply. There is nothing obscuring the horizon. There is only endlessness. As for what it profits you to pursue this possibility, to keep yourself empty and bare, says Eckhart, just following and tracking this darkness and unknowing without turning back, It contains the chance to gain him who is all things. And the more barren you are of self and unwitting of all things, the nearer you are to him. Of this barrenness it is said in Jeremiah, I will lead my beloved into the wilderness and will speak to her in her heart. The true word of eternity, Eckhart insists, is spoken only in solitude, where a man is a desert and alien to himself and multiplicity. The language in this passage is suggestive of the immense shift in self-awareness that Eckhart believes is necessary if we are to make room for God in our lives. Keep yourself empty and bare. Follow and track this darkness without turning back. Become barren of self, unwitting of all things. Become a desert, alien to yourself. It sounds like self-annihilation. This is not far from the truth. It is here, after all, where the carefully constructed and managed self confronts the endless horizon of the desert, where a real dying begins to occur. For this constructed self cannot easily let go of the images and ideas, whether of the self or of God, that form the basis of what we understand to be our identity. We recoil at the prospect of following and tracking the darkness, of acknowledging how unwitting we truly are. And it is not difficult to understand why. What, after all, will come to live in the place of this carefully constructed identity? Who will I be once I have let go of this identity? There is real terror in these questions. We are not inclined to relinquish the hard-won creations of our conscious mind, to allow ourselves to enter a free fall into what can only feel to us like a bottomless abyss. Still, Eckhart and many others in this tradition would claim, we long for this. We long to live in a larger universe, to cast ourselves out over this ocean, to be known this deeply in God. This is precisely what Eckhart invites us to do. Not to serve some abstract ideal of pure spiritual experience, but so that we may come to know God and, in the process, ourselves. The only way for this to happen, though, is for us to disappear, Eckhart would say, completely. Since it is not God's nature to be like anyone, Eckhart says, we have to come to a state of being nothing in order to enter into the same nature that he is. So when I am able to establish myself in nothing, and nothing in myself, uprooting and casting out what is in me, then I can pass into the naked being of God, which is the naked being of the Spirit. Here we find ourselves confronting a vision of the self in God that is once compelling and frightening. Do we really wish to become nothing, even in God? Perhaps not if we're being honest. We should not pretend, and certainly Eckhart does not pretend, that adopting such a posture of openness to the infinite can occur without a deep sense of disorientation. Eckhart describes a feeling of desolate self-estrangement, of exile, a sense of having been left without support from God that arises and pervades one's consciousness in such moments. This seems to be an inevitable consequence of going deeper, of leaving behind images and ideas, of finding oneself moving through an immense and mysterious darkness. Understandably, it can create a sense of bewilderment, even panic, a feeling that one must do something, anything, to reorient oneself, even if one does not know what that something ought to be. Eckhart acknowledges this, giving voice to a question from one of his hearers. If a person in such a state of is in such a state of pure nothingness, is it not better to do something to beguile the gloom and desolation, such as praying or listening to a sermon or doing something else that is virtuous so as to help himself? Eckhart's response is clear and unequivocal. No, be sure of this. Absolute stillness for as long as possible is best of all for you. Stand still and do not waver from your emptiness, for at this time you can turn away, never to turn back again. Earlier in this same sermon, Eckhart records an exchange that captures the pathos of this situation, the longing to stand in the place of safety and the awareness that we can no longer do so. The questioner asks, "Am I supposed to be in total darkness?" Eckhart's response, "Certainly. You cannot do better than to place yourself in darkness and unknowing." The questioner, "Oh, sir, must everything go then, and is there no turning back?" The response, "No, indeed. By rights there is no returning." It's difficult not to feel a certain sense of spiritual vertigo taking hold at the prospect of such radical unknowing, but this, claims Eckhart, is what is being asked of us. What is not articulated here, but what emerges with great clarity and force elsewhere in his writing, is the sense of great spiritual freedom and joy that comes from this relinquishment. Still, entering into the desert, even in the hopes of discovering such deep spiritual freedom, cannot help but seem forbidding and immensely difficult. It is, after all, a form of estrangement from all you have ever known. Another important figure from this period, the Beguine, Mechthild of Magdeburg, takes this idea of desert as estrangement and pushes it to its most extreme expression. Mechthild focuses her attention less on the idea of the desert itself and more on the kindred ideas of becoming foreign or strange or becoming alienated from oneself. For Eckhart, such language is employed mainly to express the need to make things strange to oneself in order to encounter God beyond all concepts, all images. It is part of our own work of detachment from everything in our own soul that prevents us from arriving at this honest, clear sense of the divine. For Mechthild, it refers more often to our estrangement or alienation from God. It is the equivalent of a dark night, what one writer has described as a terrible loneliness and separation. In her condition of total devotion to God, Mechthild vows to give God up if it will add to God's praise. A great darkness then overwhelms her, and she's enveloped in a complete alienation from God. Still, she is unexpectedly grateful for this loss. "Welcome, very blessed alienation," she exclaims. "You bring me unusual joy, incomprehensible marvels, and unbearable sweetness." Even so, she renounces this sweetness and once again experiences a darkness descending upon her, acknowledging the great paradox that at the center of her life, the more she accepts the blessed alienation from God and takes it on as her companion, the more strongly and marvelously does God descend upon her. This language of alienation and estrangement cannot help, I think, but feel to us as something almost wholly negative. But in this particular tradition of mystical thought and practice, it has a more ambiguous meaning. Much like the experience of lostness in Ruysbroek or the desert in Eckhart, this experience of estrangement is necessary to the work of seeking and finding God. It may also be necessary to any meaningful practice of solidarity as we move through the deserts of our own lives. This latter idea is perhaps not so clear or obvious, but I think it is worth pausing over to consider the possibilities. And I want to conclude with this last thought about how we might translate this feeling of estrangement or exile or alienation from God into our own idiom and our own situation, which is in some ways far from the world the mystics that I'm talking about lived in, but nevertheless requires just as much attention and presence as they were calling forth. The historian Michel de Certeau has argued that the upwelling of mystical practice in the Christian tradition has very often been associated with moments of acute social crisis and loss. The language of mystics, Certeau suggests, especially the language of dark night, emptiness, desolation, lostness, and estrangement, often refers not merely to interior, subjective states of spiritual loss and absence, but also to the global situation of religious faith in Western culture, including the sense of precariousness and uncertainty about God's presence in our lives. Similarly, one often finds in such moments of social crisis and spiritual uncertainty a particular orientation or openness to the unknown, what Philip Sheldrake describes as an intensity of movement ever onwards, inspired by what is not known, not possessed, not fixed or final. In this context, the relinquishment of all that is known for the sake of what can never be fully known takes on a profound moral, spiritual meaning. It becomes a way of practicing spiritual honesty in the face of profound loss and uncertainty. And in this relinquishment, we discover what is perhaps the only language available to us in such moments: silence, darkness, estrangement, and the desert. How, if at all, can such awareness help us practice accompaniment and solidarity? In his essay, Anxiety About God in an Ostensibly Godless Age, Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski noted, "Our age is marked by disquiet and uncertainty about God's presence or absence. The faithful worry about God, but their worries are really disguised worries about the world. Unbelievers worry about the world, but their worries are really disguised worries about God. But for both, the world abandoned by God is clearly a source of unease." It is impossible, of course, to quantify the extent of this unease or to be sure of its precise sources, but it's difficult to deny that it exists, or that faith itself must reckon with our own increasing sense of estrangement in the world. It is here, I think, that the language and the practice of the desert traditions can help us most. It can help alert us, I believe, to the potential importance of language and imagery in our own experience that touches into this sense of estrangement and alienation, and to see it not simply as an indication of an emptying out of all meaning, but also, potentially at least, as a deeper searching out of what it means to live with absence and loss in faith. I'm thinking, for instance, of the witness of the New Zealand poet and anthropologist Michael Jackson, who has long struggled to understand what accompaniment means for the Karanko people of Sierra Leone, many of whom have suffered the most abysmal losses during the course of the civil war that has racked their country's recent history, and many of whom have found themselves in response to this suffering reduced to silence. We can learn something from this practice of silence, Jackson suggests, especially how to resist the temptation to fill every silence with words or explanations. In the face of acute suffering, the impulse to speak or speak too quickly can be especially problematic. Sometimes, Jackson notes, our language must be measured and tempered rather than used to fill silences, or speak that which the sufferer cannot speak. And this is why we should learn the value of silence, seeing it not as a sign of indifference or resignation, but of respect. Silence is sometimes the only way we can honor the ineffability of certain experiences. Among the Karanko, it is a form of exchange, an expression of solidarity. Here, silence takes on great moral meaning and force. The reticence to speak, a sign of the deepest possible regard for the suffering of another. There's a deep resonance here with the work of Simone Weil, the French writer who made a profound effort to enter as deeply and fully as she could into the experience of those lost and exiled during World War II. For her, this work was rooted in a disciplined practice of attention, a practice which she believed held great spiritual significance. Every time we really concentrate our attention, she noted, we destroy the evil in ourselves. This is because, in doing so, we open up more space within ourselves for the presence of God, for love to suffuse our souls. Still, if the practice of attention has a profound inward orientation, it also leads inexorably outward, toward the other, toward the world. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the call to give one's attention to those caught in intense suffering. Here, Simone Weil expresses the full, indeed miraculous effect of learning to pay attention to another. Not only does the love of God have attention for its substance, the love of our neighbor, which we know to be the same love, is made of this same substance. Those who are unhappy have no need of anything in the world but people capable of giving them their attention. The capacity to give one's attention to a sufferer is a very rare and difficult thing. It is almost a miracle. It is a miracle. Nearly all those who think they have this capacity do not possess it. Warmth of heart, impulsiveness, pity are not enough. There's an understandable feeling of pessimism here regarding our capacity to accompany others in their suffering. It may not be impossible, but it is, Weil suggests, a very rare and difficult thing. Here we find ourselves close to the language of the Christian mystics, for whom becoming lost or estranged for the sake of the other is one of the highest expressions of love. But it is immensely difficult to do this. This too is part of what it is to enter the desert. One last example. The work of German writer W.G. Sebald stands out in the contemporary moment for its stark honesty and courage in navigating the post-Holocaust desert of late 20th and early 21st centuries. One of the things that characterizes Sebald's approach in works like Austerlitz, The Rings of Saturn, and Emigrants is a steady, sober gaze upon the experience of radical loss and displacement that has come to mark the experience of those who must try to exist in the aftermath of the great devastation of the Holocaust. He has become a geographer of the empty places through which we now increasingly wander in our efforts to understand the deep estrangement that marks our lives. In Austerlitz, he traces the life of one person, a man whose parents perished in the Holocaust, but who was himself saved when he was put on a kinder transport and sent to England. Still, as this man tries to share the story of who he is, he finds that he cannot do so. And here's how Sebald describes Austerlitz. Since my childhood and youth, he finally began, looking at me again, I have never known who I really was. From where I stand now, of course, I can see that my name alone and the fact that it was kept from me until my 15th year ought to have put me on the track of my origins. But it has also become clear to me of late why an agency greater than or superior to my own capacity for thought, which circumspectly directs operations somewhere in my brain, has always preserved me from my own secret, systematically preventing me from drawing the obvious conclusions and embarking on the inquiries that would have suggested to me. It hasn't been easy for me to make my way out of my own inhibitions, and will not be easy now to put the story in anything like proper order. Something as deceptively simple as putting the story in the proper order, something that I think many of us, if we reflect on it, consider to be something normal and more easily accessible to us than this, is not possible for him. There are too many gaps and empty places on the map. Memory itself is not strong enough to help him gather in all that has been lost. His own identity is hopelessly fragmented, ephemeral even. Later he reflects on what is and is not accessible to him from his own early experiences of the world. I know that I often lay awake for hours in my narrow bed in the manse, trying to conjure up the faces of those whom I had left, I feared through my own fault. But not until I was numb with weariness and my eyelids sank in the darkness did I see my mother bending down to me just for a fleeting moment, or my father smiling as he put on his hat. Such comfort made it all the worse to wake up early in the morning and have to face the knowledge, new every day, that I was not at home now, but very far away in some kind of captivity. It's not easy to know how to respond to such profound lostness, but I think it can be taken as an invitation to listen carefully, to maintain silence, to allow the emptiness and lostness of this child to find a place within us. Beyond that, it is impossible to say more. For now, it has to be enough. I think often of the hours I spent walking the grounds of La Perla in Argentina, sometimes alone, sometimes with my students, sometimes in the company of our Argentine hosts, occasionally exchanging thoughts and feelings about the place and its history, but most often moving in silence, listening, letting the silence gather, trying to pay attention. The feeling of being in this place has not left me, nor has my memory of those faces left me. But I recognize too how much still eludes me, how much remains outside of and beyond my understanding, including why I am there, why I return again and again. I recall a conversation that took place not long after one of these visits with my friend Diego Fonti, a philosopher and friend of our program, and someone who knows intimately the history of La Dictadura in Argentina. I was struggling to express to Diego all that I was feeling in response to what I had experienced that day at La Perla, including my hope of finding a way of not standing aloof to what had happened there, as well as my recognition of the culpability of my own country for countless other losses, as bad or worse than anything that had happened at La Perla, the whole overwhelming reality of it. He listened carefully and paused a long time before responding. Then he said, "Look, when it comes to this kind of thing, my dead are your dead, and your dead are my dead. We share this world. We share this experience." There are so many ways for us to practice solidarity. This is certainly one of them, recognizing how deeply we share the world and how deep our capacity is for sharing experience, in particular the experience of loss and dislocation. Sometimes we are able to do this through language and storytelling, but often we are reduced by the immensity of our experience to silence. Slowly we learn to accept our own loss and estrangement as something that enables us to participate in the dislocation of others. We must take the feeling of being at home into exile, suggests Simone Weil. We must be rooted in the absence of place. In such moments, we realize that we are already in the desert, already moving through this vast landscape, deep in the lostness, together. Thank you.
Thanks to Doug for a really thoughtful, cohesive, and quite challenging presentation of ideas. I was thinking as he was talking about desert and lostness, alienation, I think the temptation is to face the kind of challenge of hearing that, understanding it, and learning. So often our temptation is to hear something that doesn't resonate with how we may see things or want to see things, and as a consequence, we simply say it's wrong, or we say it's irrelevant. So we dismiss it so that we can get on with life as we've constructed it. So for me, the challenge is to stay open, to listen, and to hear the kind of process he's talking about and understand that it represents indeed the experience of other people with whom I might not find myself dealing with in many ways. So what I hope I can do and hope you can do is out of that sense of what he's talking about, that you formulate questions which ask, okay, so it doesn't resonate with my experience, or I don't see it that way, help me understand it. Or if it does resonate with you, you can say, yeah, and this is what I know too. So we'll take some time till 11:30, a bit past, and be open to asking questions and having him continue to help us, and then we'll move on from here. So if you have a question or comment, stand where you are. Keep it clear and succinct. Sometimes we don't have that capability. We're unclear and we keep going on and on. So clear and succinct, please.
Okay, I'll be unclear and succinct. Thank you for your presentation. Beautiful, beautiful. I do resonate with it, and what I was thinking on toward the end was our ability to tell our stories. I see that at AA meetings, and people tell their stories, and they put it together, but they always say there's gaps. I also, there's so much cultural autism, I'd like to call it, and it relates a little bit to that idea last night of historical trauma. That's my comment.
It was a comment, I believe, more than a question, but thank you for that. And what I took to be at the center of your comment was that you notice sometimes in the storytelling that you participate in and listen to others express, how often, even in ordinary conversation, there are gaps and spaces that can't easily be filled in, so that it's not, that we recognize this as part of our own experience of trying to make sense of our lives. There are certain areas that we can't easily access or make sense of, and so this is, you're commenting that this is recognizable to you, this phenomenon. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, and just in response to that, I guess I would, it's true that I lifted up some cases that are more extreme. I think for me it's partly because they can sometimes reveal something sharply that might be present to us in somewhat less extreme expressions. So what you're describing is very helpful, actually, because my own interest isn't just to kind of hold up the most extreme form of spiritual alienation and estrangement, but it's to ask, what do we do with these elements when they show up in our lives, and do we have some means available to us, whether through our teachers in the tradition or through those who accompany us, to honor these experiences and not simply to push them away. Thank you. Yes.
I don't know exactly how to express this, but Cleveland is now a center of our country for refugees. I happen to live in Lakewood, Ohio, just bordering Berea and all, and I just wish that you could express something of this solidarity idea, because we here in this area of expelled from their homes and finding a new home someplace. And we're trying to do as much. I guess what I'm asking is, you know, as individuals or as communities, if you just would have some word about, I mean, we're all out in the desert, but in different ways. Just, you know, how we personally or as communities address this.
Well, thank you for your, I can feel the depth out of which your concern is arising. The comment is just about what's been happening in Cleveland and maybe in Ohio more generally about an influx of refugees and the impact that's making on people who live here. And I take it also that you're suggesting that it's such a big experience that it's hard to know what to make of it yet, or it's hard to know how to respond. And I certainly would not stand here and pretend that I have some simple answer to that. It's happening. It's a strange moment in the human community. It's much more potent right now in many European countries. We're separated by an ocean from much of what's been happening in Syria, and so we're receiving some refugees, but nothing like the thousands and hundreds of thousands that are pouring across Europe. And I mean, anybody who's observing this has to feel this is a crisis moment for the human community. It's not easy to absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees into any body politic, and yet we're being asked to do just that, a gesture of solidarity, companionship, mercy, whatever language you want to use. And I think, you know, you're describing, well, we can go into the Old Testament and, you know, we're meant to welcome the stranger. It's right there, you know, at the heart of Scripture about who we are as believers. But as with all these things, okay, that call has now just been renewed for us. What will it mean for us to respond to it? What will it mean for us personally, communally, to dig deeper and to ask, can we respond to this call in this moment? And I can only say in response that it's a very, very difficult thing to do for anybody. And yet, Christian faith is this strange thing that keeps asking us to renew ourselves and to go deeper and to let go of more of what we thought our life consisted of. And this is a moment that's asking that of us. And that's beyond, I would say, any particular policy choice or anything that needs to be worked out in practical terms. But can we open ourselves to stand with our brothers and sisters and not shun them, you know, or engage in fear-mongering, as we've seen also. It's a very big moment in our country's cultural, spiritual history, I think.
Could I just add something to that? No, I'm just going to ask you a question. I want you to talk. You'll leave and then I have to talk. But it sounds to me like that's clearly not an issue of doctrine, which is what a lot of Christians talk about, is doctrine stuff. So could you comment on, maybe you see it as a doctrinal issue, but I was thinking, this was really not an issue of doctrine.
Well, I mean, in what category do we place these root teachings in our tradition? When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you came to visit me. These are such fundamental teachings about the centrality of accompaniment in our tradition. And some people would say, in response to your question, that's an ethical imperative. But I think it goes deeper than that. I mean, it is an ethical imperative, but it invites us to consider, just in that basic way we are invited in the New Testament, who is my neighbor? What does it mean to consider these human beings as, honestly, as brothers and sisters, as kin, as part of the fabric of my own soul in God. Now, I guess that makes it sound like I'm turning it into a question of spirituality. How surprising would that be that I would do that? But no, I mean, it's all bound together. And if you go there, then you're asking about how it is that you, and as a community, you're giving embodied expression to God in the world. And then it becomes theological bedrock. How do we give expression to God in our own lives? But I do, like many things, I think the value of spirituality can be, it's not the answer to everything, but it invites us into a searching out of our own heart, like our felt sense of connection with others, and also getting in touch with fear and anxiety over what it might mean to open myself. And then, but I think the positive thing in that is that it can open up a space of freedom. Once you kind of acknowledge your own anxiety, once you've shared it, once you put it out there, then it's not haunting you from some hidden place. You're working with it. And we need to live out of our deepest spiritual freedom for every urgent task before us. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could speak to the distinction from or the relationship of lostness and alienation to like depression.
The question is the distinction between lostness and alienation and depression. Well, the first thing I would say is I would want to be extremely careful in noticing certain distinctions in that area. I do believe that our spiritual traditions that have their own language of lostness and alienation can be helpful to us in an age when the complexity of the experience of struggle is sometimes too quickly placed in a clinical context alone. So, to the extent that this language can enrich the field in which we're thinking about somebody's experience, then I think that's a good thing. I think we know a lot more about clinical depression than we once did, and it's taught us to be respectful of that and to also recognize that in some cases there are responses that require medication and other forms of treatment, which call upon us to practice the best diagnostic medicine that we can. But it's an area that I think also benefits from having a wider field of movement. And if someone who is struggling deeply with a sense of lostness or aloneness or alienation, and who senses profoundly that it has something to do with his or her own search for God, it can do great damage if we don't take that seriously as part of a larger process. So I think it's not meant to be a substitute for all that we know about clinical depression, but it is a reminder that our human existential experience of being lost to ourselves at times is more complex than we sometimes acknowledge. And that also, if we think of our spiritual traditions, John of the Cross or Royce Brooke and these others, there's this deep sense that sometimes something very great and important is being worked out in us. That God is trying to do something through the power of love to heal us in and through this struggle. And I think it can be very valuable to hold that in the conversation. Yes?
Thank you for the lecture. And last night, when you were giving the speech, all I could think about was meditation. So, and that's something that personally I feel like my experience been resistant to, but I know that's where a lot of the answers lie.
though, yes, I've given you a very strong dose of darkness and desert, these two talks, and maybe they'll keep you for a while, not needing any more, but it's an approach to this opening up of our consciousness to God. And one of the glorious things about our tradition is that there are many other approaches that help us access this experience. And so you're a musician, song, dance, life in community, children, raising children. People find this astounding. None of you who have children will find this astounding, but people, I was in the Philippines, and I was invited there to speak to just a marvelous, marvelous gathering of religious men and women from all over Asia. It's a Roman Catholic gathering. There were 500, 600, mostly nuns from Vietnam, China, Myanmar, Korea, the Philippines, and in full habit. This is something that we hardly ever see in this country anymore. And one of the things that was just kind of hard for them to absorb in what I was saying to them about spiritual practice was that I'm married, I have 5 children, and this is again maybe more a Catholic thing. The Catholic world used to divide very clearly the way of the contemplatives and the way of those called to the more active life. But yes, so family life, work, all these forms, can these be spaces of contemplative awareness? And my answer would be absolutely. But to get back to your question, so does it help to have a practice? It does. And again, here, rather than one size fits all, I think each person has to test his or her own inclination. Because some people find it exceedingly difficult to be quiet or to be still, and just by temperament they're more ecstatic creatures. And pay attention to that. Don't force don't force a round block into a square hole. But having said that, we also have to face the fact that we inhabit a very, very active, busy culture that doesn't really value stillness and silence very much, in which there are very few spaces where our devices are ever actually really turned off completely and we're by ourselves. So the simple practice of beginning to allow yourself to sit for 10 minutes, and I would recommend Martin Laird's book, Into the Silent Land, a simple, beautiful primer on Christian contemplative prayer. It's a great place to start because Laird is a very experienced teacher. He says, look, in some ways we just have to give ourselves over to it. Sit yourself down in a chair, get comfortable, turn off your devices, pay attention to your breathing, perhaps employ a prayer word, Jesus' prayer, or some other form of mantra. The Christian monks did this from ages ago. And stay with it. And you'll feel restless at times, you'll feel like you can't do it, it's not accessible to you, Silent Land. It's Into the Silent Land. It's a blessedly short little book. No, it's a very, very fine introduction to this practice.
I just wanted to get that book, but I also had a quick, strange question. As an ordained clergy person, we had a very robust discussion about prayer a month ago. There was about to be a fight, I think. But there were people who were saying, we believe in prayer, and almost arrogantly, smugly saying, we believe in the power
I'm going to be pretty arbitrarily interrupting and otherwise finishing this morning's session. Absolute delight this half hour, the kind of depth of question, the feeling tone that is unmistakable. So it's wonderful to have Douglas here to entertain this. It's a reminder to me why to have this opportunity is such a rich possibility that we've actualized again this year.